Welcome, everyone, to the February presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the New Mexico History Museum's Friends of History, and will be your host today. We are happy to announce, by way of introduction, that the Friends now have a new webpage. We are quite excited by this because this webpage will provide information on all Friends activities and updated regularly. For example, all past and future First Wednesday online lectures, such as the one we're having today, will now be permanently available on this webpage through the First Wednesday Lecture Series link. There will also be information on the walking tours of the historic downtown Santa Fe and of upcoming events when we move past the COVID restrictions. So check out our website. The link is provided at the bottom of this video screen. As you know, these lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with support from the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept contributions, and all of which will go directly to support the lecture series, and more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our new website. Before introducing today's speaker, I want to briefly share with you information on our next month's lecture. This will occur on Wednesday, March 3rd, and Dr. Richard Ford, Emeritus Professor for Anthropology at the University of Michigan and Research Associate with the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture here in Santa Fe, will discuss Royal A. Prentice, a pioneer archaeologist in New Mexico. Also participating will be Allison Colburn, the librarian for the Laboratory of Anthropology, and Gary Hine, a retired nuclear scientist who first identified the work which Royal Prentice undertook in archaeology. Now, our speaker today is Dr. Colin G. Calloway, John Kimball Jr., 1943 Professor of History and Professor of Native American Studies at Dartmouth College. Professor Calloway grew up in England and received his Ph.D. from the University of Leeds. In the US, he has worked at the Center for the History of the American Indian at the Newberry Library in Chicago and taught at the University of Wyoming and presently at Dartmouth College. He has published more than a dozen books, including One Vast Winter Count, The Native American West Before Lewis and Clark. This book won 6 awards. Another volume is The Indian World of George Washington, which was a National Book Award finalist and won the George Washington Prize. He has been president of the American Society for Ethnohistory and received the Western History Association's American Indian History Lifetime Achievement Award. A list of his most recent publications is provided in the chat room. Dr. Calloway will be speaking today on the smallpox epidemic of 1779 to 1784. This epidemic came up the Camino Real. Following the presentation, we will have a live question and answer session with Dr. Calloway. Your questions and comments can be posted at any time on the YouTube chat room during and after the presentation. Upon completion, both the lecture and the Q&A session will be posted on the Friends of History webpage and the History Museum's Facebook and YouTube pages. And now we welcome Professor Calloway.
Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. What I'm going to talk about today is something that I've done a lot of research on a long time ago, and it's, in a way, kind of become topical. I teach Native American history at Dartmouth College, and of course, I spend a lot of time talking about the impact of newly introduced epidemic diseases on indigenous populations, society, culture, etc. And I've often felt in doing that, that students, and perhaps students in this sense are no different from the rest of us, we kind of empathize and understand the enormity of what was going on, but seemed very removed from it. Similarly, as if we were talking about the Black Death or the numerous plagues in Europe, it's almost a sense that was so long ago and people were so unsophisticated, and now we're not vulnerable to those things in the way that we were. Well, obviously, a lot has changed in the last year. 20 years or so ago, when I was researching for the book One Vast Winter Count, I spent a lot of time looking into the smallpox pandemic that was going on about the time of the American Revolution. At the time, the only people I knew who were working on it were myself and Elizabeth Fenn. 20 years went on and wrote a book called Pox Americana, where she looked at smallpox across the country, including its impact in the East, Washington's army, etc. I was focused on the West and its impact in Indian country. But I remember one time talking about this epidemic in class, and a student raised her hand and asked what I meant when I said pandemic. I don't think that would be the case anymore. But I do think it is important to get our heads around the recurrent impacts of disease in human history, not just in Native American history. Years ago, I think William McNeill said, we don't like to do that. We like to think of our history as being shaped and our destinies being shaped by human beings. We like to feel that we're in control of our own destinies. If we acknowledge that germs and viruses are going to affect our lives and end our lives and shape our history, that's very uncomfortable. Well, we don't have much choice now. We see it and we recognize what's going on. And I think that gives us perhaps a measure of greater understanding of what it's been a fairly common experience for human societies, well, forever, I suppose. So I'd like to start by just looking at this map, which is something a kind of mental exercise I do a lot with my students. Usually I just ask them to imagine a map, which in itself these days is sometimes a channel without a smartphone. But I say, imagine a map without state boundaries and without highways. Think of the continent as it was, where the main features are rivers and mountains. And if you look at those main features, the Appalachian Mountain Chain, the Rocky Mountain Chain, the Mississippi, the Missouri, Ohio watershed, notice that those things run south and north. And yet, when we talk about American history very often, especially in popular culture, American history is depicted as unfolding, developing, if you like, from east to west, which is going against the grain, if you like, of the mountains and the river systems. And certainly in looking at Native America, I think it's important to recognize that some of the major developments that affected lives and experiences and futures on this continent came not from the east, but came from the south. Corn spread north from Mexico. Horses spread north from Mexico. And the smallpox epidemic that I'm going to talk about today spreads north from Mexico. When we think about the impact of epidemic diseases on Native American populations, I think it's so dramatic, it's so impactful that we can sometimes fall prey to seeing that in its proper context. It was part of the package of things that were introduced into this continent by European colonizers and European invaders. And those things exacerbated the impact of disease. The impact of disease on populations that had had little or no exposure to those diseases was, of course, devastating, but it was made more devastating by the coincidental impacts of war, starvation, disruption of traditional economy, fur trade, slave trade, introduction of guns, escalating violence, etc., etc. And what I'm going to talk about today, but it was made more the way in which, as I see this epidemic disease unfolding, it spreads in the ways that it does and at the speed that it does, because in large measure of the prior introduction into North America by the Spaniards of horses, which, of course, as we well know, transforms life on the plains. At one point in my life, I was a regular commuter between Vermont and Wyoming in a small Toyota Tercel, and you really get a sense of the enormity of the plains that way. The impact of horses in not only making native people more mobile, but giving them enhanced access to the resources of the plains, and in particular the buffalo herds, was hugely significant. And of course, Indian people competed to get access to these horses. And this is just a very rough map that I sketched out showing how horses spread across the plains. Initially, the Spaniards tried to keep horses out of the hands of Indian people as they did guns, but that was almost an impossibility. And of course, after the success of the Pueblo Revolt, or what I call the Pueblo War of Independence in 1680, then horses are free to spread, and Indian people are free to spread, to obtain horses and then to spread those horses through trading and raiding. And because horses transformed the way of life on the plains, they were a game changer on the plains, because everybody was eager to get them. People raided for horses, people traveled for across large distances to get horses. Indian people from deep in the plains, even from the northern plains, travel down to the Spanish settlements, to Santa Fe, to acquire horses. And in the course of less than a century, horses spread north, northeast across the plains until they reached the Canadian prairies. And Indian people, some Indian people, are attracted onto the plains because of the presence of horses and the unprecedented opportunities for power and prosperity that those horses afforded, especially in conjunction with buffalo and these enormous grasslands that supported buffalo. So the Cheyenne, if you see right there in the middle of the map, when the French first meet the Cheyenne, they meet them on the western shores of the Great Lakes. Even prior to the American Revolution, Cheyenne people are still living in sedentary or semi-sedentary villages on the Missouri River. And then they move on to the plains. And they give up farming, they give up agriculture to become buffalo hunting, equestrian, what Americans would call nomads. In a European understanding of human development of human society, that was going backwards, because the understanding, as explained by the Scottish Enlightenment and other thinkers, was that human societies developed from primitive hunting societies to farming societies and onwards. The Cheyennes had been farming and now they went backwards. It wasn't because they didn't understand history. It was because for Cheyennes, in the 18th century, like for white Americans in the 19th century, the West was a land of opportunity. And the opportunity was afforded by horses and the chance to harvest buffalo herds and buffalo meat and buffalo products in a way they'd never done before. But it wasn't that simple. I make no apologies for this map. I actually did this map many years ago watching my son in a Little League baseball game. And then I kind of made this kind of rough copy from it, and I've never done anything to make it look as if I knew what I was doing. But I think you see the point. So if you look at the spread of horses from the south northwards across the plains, and then look at the red arrows, what's going on at roughly the same time, a little later in some areas, depending where you are, is that also spreading across the plains, primarily coming out of Canada, where you have French Canadian, then British traders, is that guns are infiltrating the plains. And that sets up a dramatic dynamic in which two frontiers are advancing across the plains toward each other and then crossing and overlapping. Horses spreading from the south, guns spreading from the north, and each one is a game changer. If you don't have them, you need them. If you lack one of them and your neighbors have got two of them, you're in trouble. So everybody is contending, competing, jostling for position to get access to both horses and guns, which means that by the middle of the 18th century, the Great Plains is not a place where, if you look at one of those many maps showing Indian country, people are locked and frozen in position. It would be more accurate to see it as a sort of a mosaic or a kaleidoscope in which vibrant trade networks are humming with activity. People are moving back and forward. And that sets up a situation in which, when disease arrives, the possibilities for its spread and a rapid spread are enormous. If you just look at this map, you'll see a couple of places that I'm going to talk about. One is the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara sort of trade rendezvous, and the other is the Shoshone rendezvous in southwest Wyoming, which would be around Green River. When Lewis and Clark met the Shoshones in 1805, they saw they had horses with Spanish saddles, Spanish bridles, Spanish brands on them. And they said, "Where'd you get those horses?" And the Shoshones say, "We got them from the Spaniards. They are 12 days ride away." Smallpox takes about 14 days for the symptoms to show, the lesions and the horrible things that we associate with smallpox, which means that Shoshone men who rode hard down towards Santa Fe to get horses but came back with smallpox would be home kissing their wives, nuzzling their babies before they knew they had it. And that gives you a sense of how these populations, who are in pursuit of power and prosperity, right, in some ways they've never had it so good, are left exposed to this devastating disease. If you look at the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara villages on the Great Bend of the Upper Missouri there, those peoples had been there centuries. Unlike some of the other people on the plains, these people on the edges of the plains go back to, the equivalent of the European Middle Ages. And it seems like they'd always been a trade center because they were surrounded by cornfields. Mandan, Hidatsa women cultivated enormous fields of corn. That was the staple of their power, and prosperity. Now, they would go seasonally buffalo hunting, but agriculture was the core of their life. That meant that Mandan and Hidatsa people traded agricultural produce for the products of the hunt, for people coming off the plains, people coming out of the northern woodlands, which is beyond the zone of corn growing seasons, and were already there, the center, at the hub, if you like, of a trade network. And then you add to that horses coming from the south and guns coming from the north. That means that more and more people are shuttling back and forward, and more people are coming in and out of the Mandan and Hidatsa villages. When Lewis and Clark were there in the winter of 1804, 1805, they recorded about Indian people from about 24 tribes passing through the villages. And that was in the winter. Those villages are hubs of trade networks that connect with one another. So if we take the example of the Cheyenne have moved into the center of the plains not only to get buffalo, but also to position themselves in these trade networks. So they trade to the Hidatsa villages, where they get agricultural produce and then guns, steel weapons, and the products of British trading companies. And then they trade those to their Arapaho, Kiowa, Comanche neighbors further south for more horses, which they then take back to the villages to trade for more goods. And everybody's doing that to some extent. So I think you get the picture of this of the Great Plains as a region crisscrossed by pulsating trade networks. With the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara, they're there in bold, one of the major hubs of that. But we're looking at this green area of the Great Plains in particular. So then, in September 1779, smallpox breaks out in Mexico City. From there, it spreads southward. It goes to Guatemala, Yucatan, goes up, throughout Latin and South America. It spreads to Baja California, and it spreads north to New Mexico, as Ben mentioned, on Camino Real. It reaches New Mexico in 1780, and it kills at least 5,000 people. And we know that because Spanish missionaries kept a toll of the death counts in the various Pueblo villages. Now, this is not the first big smallpox epidemic in the American West by any means, but one of the reasons why it's so interesting and why I was able to do research on it is that this occurs at a time when there are people in key places in the western half of the continent who were able to record it, to see what was going on, to tell us what was going on. And so we can't track its every move, but we can pick it up at key points as it makes its way north across the continent. So once it reaches Santa Fe, of course, it's at a key point in the horse trade. Shoshones and other people travel regularly to Santa Fe and to San Antonio, to places to get horses, either to trade for them or to raid for them. So once it's in Santa Fe and in New Mexico, it's a little bit like having dropped a match into a powder keg. It can go everywhere. and it kind of does. So Comanches get smallpox. In 1783-84, a group of Comanches tell Spanish traders that they've lost 3/4 of their people. Now, I don't think that means of the entire Comanche population. I suspect that's that particular band of Comanches. Nonetheless, this is massive. And the Shoshones are not the only people who travel to Santa Fe to get horses. But the Shoshones catch smallpox. And then the Blackfeet get smallpox. And we know how and when the Blackfeet get smallpox through an oral tradition recorded by a fur trader by the name of David Thompson. He was actually a Welsh fur trader working for the Hudson Bay Company, maybe also a stint with the Northwest Company in Canada. But a Cree Indian, a guy by the name of Sucomapi, who was living with the Blackfeet, told David Thompson that he remembered a number of things. He remembered the first time that the Blackfeet encountered horses. And that was not a good day for the Blackfeet because the horses had Shoshones on them. And meeting Shoshone cavalry for the first time put the Blackfeet at a huge disadvantage. And the Shoshones were actually able to push them northward into Alberta, Saskatchewan, etc., until the Blackfeet get horses. And then, remembering that diagram that I had on the previous slide, then the Blackfeet get guns. Right? So whereas the Shoshones had gotten horses first, and then the Blackfeet get horses, now the Blackfeet get guns. Right? And having learned their lesson, the Blackfoot make sure that the Shoshones and the Nez Perce and the Kootenai and the Flathead don't get guns. So they kind of establish what the British fur traders call a Blackfoot wall. They prevent the Brits from trading guns to their enemies further south, which allows them to push the Shoshones off the plains, to push the Shoshones into the foothills of the Rockies, which is where Lewis and Clark meet them. But in 1780, according to Sucomapi, a Blackfoot war party attacks a Shoshone village, and they think they've caught the Shoshones napping. They rip open the lodges with their knives, and then they recoil in horror, because inside the lodges are dead and dying corpses rotting from smallpox. And the Blackfeet turn tail and head for home and take smallpox with them. And from the Blackfeet, it spreads north to the Chippewyans, where scholars estimate maybe it killed 80% of the population. And it spreads to the Cree. And the Cree have established themselves as middlemen. There are Cree on the shores of Hudson Bay, Eastern Cree, and there are Cree now who've moved west onto the plains. And they've been shuttling back and forth between Hudson Bay Company traders and Indian people on the Canadian prairies. In the winter of 1783-84, Hudson Bay Company traders realized that something's up, because for years, Cree and Ojibwe people have brought beaver pelts to the Hudson Bay Company posts on the shores of Hudson Bay. Sometimes they'd hunted those pelts themselves, but often what they'd done is obtained those pelts from other Indian people farther west, to whom they traded the goods that they got from the posts on Hudson Bay. And so the Hudson Bay Company traders really didn't have to do a whole lot. They just sat in their stores, and Indian customers would bring in pelts, exchange them for manufactured goods, go back out into Indian country, exchange those manufactured goods for more pelts, etc. Well, winter 1783, no one shows up. And Hudson Bay Company traders say, they note this in their journals, and then they say, okay, we better go out to the Indians' villages. And they go out to the Indians' encampments, and they find those encampments are devastated. Most people are dead. And they actually say in their journals that they went among the dead. They went into the lodges and picked up the beaver pelts that those people who had collected but had not been able to deliver to the posts on the bay. That's the same disease. It's the same epidemic that had broken out in Mexico City in September 1779. And it's made its way up through the plains, across the Canadian prairies, and to the shores of Hudson Bay in 4 years. This is a pandemic. And our sense of its impact in Indian country, it's as if we can get glimpses of it when there's somebody there to record it. Now, if you look to the west, if you look from the Shoshones and the Blackfeet, you'll see that this disease, this smallpox, makes its way down the Columbia River to the northwest coast, which it does. We know that. Because at the Dalles on the Columbia River is a trade center where Indian people fish and store enormous quantities of salmon. This was one of the richest, if not the richest, salmon fishing grounds in the world. And people go there to trade. So, of course, smallpox makes its way down there. When George Vancouver, an English sea captain, is on the coast, northwest coast in the early 1790s, he talks about, in his journal, he talks about seeing skeletons on the beach. He says it's like a new Golgotha. There was clearly something dramatic, catastrophic happened here. Well, it was smallpox. It was this smallpox epidemic. The only question is, did it come down the Columbia River? We know that it did. Did it only come down the Columbia River? If you look at this, which is another of my manufactured maps, it's a little more professional looking because, well, by the time I had did this one, I had a daughter who was a little bit more savvy. But this is a map that shows the operation of the sea otter trade. Sea otters are incredibly cute. They're doing neat things like swimming around and breaking shells on their tummies, but they're also incredibly easy to hunt. And were hunted because their pelts were so lustrous. Meriwether Lewis said he'd never seen anything like it. And of course, that made them extremely valuable in certain areas of the world. Now, the Russians had begun harvesting, hunting for sea otter pelts in the 1740s, or rather getting indigenous people to do them under coercion. But the sea otter trade really took off actually about the time of the American Revolution. In 1775, James Cook, an English sea captain, set out on a voyage around the world. It was actually the longest voyage in the age of sail. James Cook didn't make it around the world because he got himself killed in Hawaii, but his crew did. And among his crew was an American by the name of John Ledyard, who was actually, I hate to say it, a Dartmouth dropout. He spent a year at Dartmouth and then, I guess, was taking a gap year, finished up in England about the time of the American Revolution, and signed on with James Cook's crew. And here's what happened. They sailed from England south through the Atlantic, around the southern tip of South America, and up to the northwest coast of North America, where people had not had much contact with Europeans before. But they did know that Europeans wanted sea otter pelts. And so when Cook's ships docked, or weighed anchor, I guess they would have docked, Indian people in cedar bark canoes came out to trade. And of course, what happened was the Cook's crew emptied their cargo and exchanged the contents, guns, alcohol, woolen cloth, metal tools, all of that kind of thing, for sea otter pelts. And then they left, sailed across the Pacific, spent the winter in Hawaii for some R&R, and so Cook could get himself killed. And then went to China, where they sold those sea otter pelts at a huge profit because these were in enormous demand by Chinese elites. And once you'd done that, you'd empty your cargo again. You filled your cargo, they filled their cargo holds with the things that were in demand in England: tea, silk, spices, right? And continued the voyage to England. So if you look at that, what you have is a triangular trade network, not unlike the triangular slave trade network that operated between England and Africa. Everywhere the ship touches land, they trade and they make a killing. And Ledyard went back to America, lobbied Congress. In fact, it said that his is the first book published in America saying the United States has to get in on this act, which it did. And very quickly, ships from Boston were doing this same trade route. They had an advantage over ships from Europe, from England and France and Sweden and Portugal. Everybody was doing this. But the Americans had the advantage because they were the right side of the Atlantic. So you sail from Boston around the tip of the southern tip of the continent to the northwest coast. You trade for sea otter pelts. Then you go to China and you trade sea otter pelts for silk and spices and tea and back to Boston. That means that those Indian people on the northwest coast, who, if we take a view of American expansion that goes from east to west, have yet to feel the full force of European contact, are not actually on the edge. They're in the center. They're in the middle of a global trade network, trading with ships that have crew members not just from Europe, but also from China. And those trade networks, like the trade networks that operate across the plains, function as arteries or tendrils or highways for the spread of disease. And there's a massive smallpox epidemic in Russia at this time. And so one of the questions is, we know there was smallpox on the northwest coast. Did it just come from the epidemic that started out in Mexico City, or did it come from somewhere else? Did it come from the other side of the world? Now, this was not the first epidemic. It was not the last. But we have documentation of it. And one of the reasons I think that American historians have not paid much attention to it is, of course, that the area west of the Mississippi is not yet America. Right? And so the story, if you like, or the documentation of this epidemic is not in American records so much as it is in British, Spanish, French records. And by looking there, you get a sense of it. But it's just one in a long series of epidemics, and even one in a long series of smallpox epidemics. And there are indigenous records too. This is Lone Dog's winter count. And winter counts are incredibly interesting things. They're history books. They are means by which communities retain and record the memory of a year, each year having a winter. Right? It's like a calendar made up of symbols that serve as mnemonic devices, so that the historian, the person who makes or preserves this hide record, can look at them and recall what happened. Typically, we have one at the Hood Museum at Dartmouth, which is rectangular. It's done on cloth. Typically, winter counts are done on animal hides, and they start in the middle and spiral outwards. So if you look at the second symbol right in the center of this, you may not be able to see it too clearly, but it's a human torso, head and shoulders, no arms. The torso is flecked with red, and that's a standard signifier on winter counts of smallpox usually, although it could be measles. Right? So we know there was smallpox right there, almost at the beginning of this winter count. But when did it start? How do we know when it starts? Well, if you follow the cycle or the circular of symbols around until you come to, let's call it 4 o'clock. If you look southwest of where the human torso with the red flecking is, you'll see something that looks like a crescent moon with a bunch of stars around it. That is the great meteor shower that happened in November 1833 and seems to have been visible everywhere in the Western United States. And obviously, it was an event that made an impression. So people who were recording significant events on winter counts record that. So one of the things that I've been able to do, and one can do, is look at multiple winter counts that all start and end at different times. But you find November 1833, and then you can read from that backwards and forwards and see when human torsos flecked in red or other diseases, coughing or whatever indicated. And by looking at several winter counts, you can see how these epidemics move across the country. One of the big smallpox epidemics, certainly the most famous or notorious, happens in 1837. In that year, an American steamer docks at Fort Clark, which had been established next to the Mandan villages, which, as you remember, were the hub of a trade network that reached halfway across the continent. And these were people who had built power and prosperity on the basis of corn and trade. They took a tremendous hit in the epidemic of 1780. When Lewis and Clark met the Mandans and the Hidatsas in 1804, those people told them, we are a shadow of ourselves, what we were. We used to live in 32 villages, 7 villages. Now we live in 2 or 3 villages. But worse was to come. This is a man known as, his name was Matutope, meaning forebears. He was the second principal chief of the Mandan in the 1830s. And he was a big deal. And so we have portraits of him. because when George Catlin was traveling up the Missouri River in the early 1830s, and when Karl Bodemer, the Swiss artist whose work this is, was traveling in the same area, they both made portraits of him. And here he is, in a sense, presenting himself as a warrior, a defender of his people. And I like to use this in class to kind of decode that and have the students read what all of these markers mean. But Forebears dies of smallpox. And he says in a speech attributed to him as his dying speech, "I was once a great warrior, and now look at me. Even the wolves recoil from me in horror because my face is rotting." If you look at the Mandan population here, when the French first encounter the Mandans in the 1730s, they estimate their population at about 15,000. After the smallpox epidemic that we've been talking about, that population has been sized to a little more than 3,500. In June of 1837, which was before smallpox arrived on that steamship, they may have had as many as 2,000 people. In October of 1837, after that smallpox had ripped through their population, 138 people survived. And the Mandans and the Hadatsas, who were also hit, and the Arikaras, moved upriver and became the three affiliated tribes where they were the population of what is now Fort Berthold. But of course, what happened in Mandan didn't stay in Mandan, because the Mandan Hidatsa villages were this central location of trade networks that spread across the plains. So this smallpox epidemic, once it hits the Mandan Hidatsa villages, goes everywhere. It hits the Assiniboine, it hits the Blackfeet, and it does in reverse what the smallpox epidemic we've been talking about did. It travels south across the plains. And a Kiowa calendar shows smallpox in 1839-40. It's this epidemic. And I've just put there for a comparative look at what was going on here, smallpox and other epidemics among the Pawnees, right, on the Missouri River, east central Nebraska. Every population is being hit, not just once, but time and time again. So unlike populations that are hit once and have the opportunity to recover, indigenous populations don't have that opportunity. If you get smallpox and you live, you're pockmarked, left by the lesions that have ruptured and dried up, but you're immune for life. George Washington had smallpox as a young man and was immune for life, but your children are not. So smallpox can come again. And in addition, if you survive smallpox, you are weakened, your community is weakened and more vulnerable to measles, to cholera, to pneumonic plague, bubonic plague, etc., etc. So when we're looking at this comment, one of the great untold stories, I think, is the recurrent ravages of newly introduced epidemic diseases and what that does to native populations, not just in raw numbers, but now I think we're getting a sense of it. What does it do to how people live? What does it do to how people interact with one another? What does it do to the fabric of society, how people go around their lives, how they think about the world? Some people become suicidal after losing loved ones. This is a massive, massive impact on Indian America. So why does this matter to the history of the United States? Because to look at our history books, the really important stuff happening in these years is not happening in Santa Fe or Hudson Bay. It's happening in Boston and Yorktown, because this is the American Revolution. And the American Revolution is a war for independence, but it's also a war about who has access to Indian land. Can the British Crown restrict Americans' access to Indian land, as it had tried to do? The answer is no, after independence is secured. And the United States turns west to build a nation on Indian land. Some of it, as in the brown area here, land that has been ceded, transferred to it by Great Britain, but also across the west of the continent. George Washington understood that the nation that he had helped to bring to life would expand and become great by its growth across Indian land. So when the United States acquires Louisiana Territory, and it purchases Louisiana Territory from France in 1803, it doubles its size overnight. We know that. And then expands into that area. But of course, it's expanding into a world that's hugely changed over the previous 100 years as a result of horses and guns, and above all, I think, as a result of the smallpox epidemic that we've talked about and other epidemics that continue to plague literally the people of that area. So that Native American capacity for resistance and for dealing with the United States and American expansion as it moves into their homelands is radically altered and undermined long before this territory becomes the United States. And I want to just end with another plug for looking at the unseen forces of history. We know that Thomas Jefferson secured the Louisiana Purchase. He wanted New Orleans. Jefferson said, whoever controls New Orleans is our natural enemy, because whoever controlled New Orleans controlled traffic on the Mississippi River. That was how farmers in the banks of the Tennessee, the banks of the Ohio could get produce to market, all kinds of things. Jefferson wanted to buy New Orleans, but when his ministers got to Paris to put in the bid, the French basically said, why don't you take the whole lot? And sold them Louisiana Territory. That was a huge coup, and Jefferson gets credit for it. But this is the guy that really deserves the credit for it. When the American Revolution happens, it unleashes ideas and ideals. Those ideals spread to France. The French Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, transforming the world. But those ideals don't just stay in France. They reach French colonies. And one of France's most richest colonies was a place called Saint Domingue, Haiti, which we're used to thinking of one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. It was the jewel of the French colonial crown. But Haiti exploded in revolution because Haiti was a sugar colony, which meant that it was a slave colony, in which a minority of French colonists inhabited an island with a massive majority of enslaved people. It was, I think, the only successful slave rebellion in history, and it resulted in the creation of a black republic in the Atlantic in roughly the same era as the American Rebellion. The American War of Independence produced the American Republic. Napoleon Bonaparte, which secured Louisiana from Spain, had visions of restoring France's empire in North America, an empire that it had lost to Britain in 1763. But before he could do that, and before he could send troops to occupy Louisiana Territory, he had to get control of the slave rebellion at the mouth of the Gulf of Mexico, literally. So he sent armies to Haiti, to San Domingue. And those armies did what British armies had done before them, what European armies did in that climate and that environment. They died of malaria and yellow fever. Not sure if this is actually the right mosquito. I suppose I was looking for a picture of Aedes aegypti, which is apparently the mosquito that carries yellow fever. I may be giving this guy bad press. He may not be the right one. But the point is, this was something beyond human control at the time. It's a little bit like reading the Old Testament and the Bible, where they talk about huge armies being swept away by the angel of the Lord, probably an outbreak of epidemic disease. Napoleon's armies were swept away by mosquito carrying yellow fever. That was a huge moment in determining the future and the history of the United States. So it's not only that Louisiana Territory is shaped and changed by the smallpox epidemic that we've been talking about and other epidemics before the United States acquired it, but disease, yellow fever, also determines that the United States gets it. Those are things that we don't really see if we look at a textbook map like this, where it really just looks pretty inevitable. Jefferson envisioned an ocean-to-ocean republic, and there it is. The original 13 colonies, Louisiana Purchase, all that admission of Texas, or the annexation of Texas and all those territories from the war with Mexico. It's not inevitable. And disease plays a huge factor in human history and in determining human destinies, whether it's the United States, as we now know, or Indian people. Thank you very much.
Well, Colin, thank you very much. It's just such a wealth of information and insight that offers perspectives that I know that for myself have always been kind of vaguely in the background, but certainly has enriched my understanding. And I think others' understanding in terms of the dynamics in the far West before the arrival of the Americans and the impact that it had on the advance westward. Number of things struck me. Of course, the north-south movement, and as that compares to what we saw in American history in terms of East-West, I think is particularly helpful in understanding the dynamic, and it's certainly brought home here in the context of this of this pandemic. And it brings home to the importance of the opening of the Santa Fe Trail and the shift that occurs, in that orientation here in the Southwest, and perhaps even offers some insight in terms of understanding how the understanding in terms of the dynamics in the Southwest as the U.S. moved west. Understand why there was, and perhaps not as much understanding in terms of dynamics in terms of the Spanish period in that context. We have a number of comments, and I'll just start going through them. Rob Martinez, who is our state historian, and made a comment complimenting you on your hand-drawn maps and how.
All right, thank you, Rob.
So I want you to know that they are much appreciated.
Yeah.
Secondly, we, of course, in terms of the impact within New Mexico itself, you mentioned roughly 5,000 people, as best records showed at that time, were perhaps died at least died as a result of this pandemic. Much of that, as I understand it, were predominantly within the pueblos themselves. I mean, Spanish were clearly affected. You can see it in the Spanish records. But I don't certainly. Perhaps you could talk a bit about the impact in terms of that, in terms of the Pueblo community and its struggle to retain its identity, and of course down the road its ability to have some success in retaining its sense of integrity.
So before I do anything else, I realized that when I was talking about the winter count, I misled you all. I was trying to focus your attention on the meteor shower, which appears at 8 o'clock, not at 4 o'clock. And I'm sitting here with a wristwatch on my hand. You'd think I could have gotten that right, but I kind of get jazzed on the interesting stuff and the other things not so much. But so I apologize for that, which didn't help you at all. But I think
the symbol was very clear.
All right. But certainly, actually, thinking about the broader impact in New Mexico, I mean, I know that within New Mexico, I remember there's an account where the Hopi people are saying, well, we think we may be staring extinction in the face here. Obviously, that wasn't the case. And obviously, one of the things that Pueblo peoples have done, they've become almost a byword for survival in the face of adversity, etc. But the other thing that struck me was that, of course, this was something that would have effects throughout New Mexico. And when I was going to do this talk, I looked back at my the book that I'd written from it, and reminded myself that maybe the first person, one of the first people, if not the first person, to write about this epidemic in New Mexico was not me or Elizabeth Fenn. It was Mark Simmons, of course, right? And if you know anything about New Mexico history, I suspect you think, well, yeah. As I remember, it's a very short piece, but Mark, and that was like 1966, right, when people weren't. Well, most people weren't interested in Native American history and et cetera, et cetera. He was a real pathbreaker in lots of ways, I think. But of course, he talks in there about how this wasn't just Pueblos. I was particularly interested in Pueblos where there are priests recording it. But of course, it made its way into the towns. So when I used that term 5,000, which wasn't my calculation, I lifted it from somebody else, that I suspect is probably the baseline. And I think that the impact was likely of being much, much larger than that. The other thing that I remember, and this is going back now, 20 years when I was working on this, was, and I hadn't really thought about this until this year, that I remember seeing accounts where people were talking about smallpox before it had arrived, right? Which, of course, given our experience in the past year, was kind of haunting a little bit. And I don't, perhaps didn't give it enough attention, but, people knew this was coming, because these were people, even though, New Mexico was a long way from Mexico City, these are interconnected worlds. And I tried to, I think, create that impression of interconnectedness, but which also meant that people, not just Native people, particular Native people, are in many ways living in a disease environment. And I think that's something that we forget. I was talking about yellow fever, of course. In 1793, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, and the rest of the government fled Philadelphia because yellow fever was in town. Mm-hmm. And that was a recurrent disease on the east coast of the United States. And I think we, perhaps in the 20th century, were fortunate in being able to forget what it was like, where people lived with recurrent disease as a way of life. And the other thing I wanted to add about New Mexico, if we could maybe lump New Mexico and Texas together, and I know enough people from New Mexico to realize I'm treading dangerous ground there. But Liz Fenn, in her book, Pox Americana, and if you're interested in this, I recommend the book to you. She looks at the smallpox epidemic in the whole United States. So talks about Washington inoculating his army outside of Boston, etc. And that there's a possibility that the smallpox epidemic that I'm talking about came, I wouldn't say not from New Mexico, I'd say not from Mexico, as well as from Mexico, maybe also came east across Louisiana, Texas. Liz certainly has a lot of evidence talking about that. So just as on the Northwest coast, where we may have gotten a confluence of smallpox epidemics, you could perhaps still be having, that too on the southern plains and the Southwest. And it really, I think, gives us a stark reminder of the frequency and the recurrence of this, that these were part of life. And especially, I think, for Native people, I often think that Native American people live in a disease environment. And perhaps from a modern perspective, everybody does, children dying young and all of that kind of thing that we're so familiar with. But it seems to have just been such an inescapable part of life. And as I tried to convey, and I think shapes not only people's lives, but also shapes the courses of history.
Yes. I wanted to share with you, there's been a bit of a dialogue on chat. We had a question that came up from one of our participants in terms of what the impact of the epidemic would have been on the Henizaro population, particularly in Abiquiu.
Okay. Yeah.
And another participant followed up and said, well, the Abiquiu parish books kept by the local priest should contain the list of the burials reflecting the effects on that. So that's clearly a mixed community. And
that's actually a better answer than I would have given. I would have hoped there might be parish records. This sounds much more confident.
Yes.
So go with that one.
And but also it was a source of course, the contact between the Abiquiu community and the Utes was ongoing. Right.
Yeah.
And so again, serving as another vector in terms of that of the spread of the disease through the Utes. Not exclusive, of course, but just one more aspect of that.
And that's another piece of my sort of ongoing crusade, I guess, to break down that idea of a steadily advancing if you like, Indian white frontier. Because wherever you look, I mean, right now I'm in the beginning stages of a book on Scotch-Irish people on successive frontiers. You don't have that frontier. You have areas where people are living alongside each other, even if they're very often in hostility and enmity. They're also what somebody once called frontiers of inclusion, where a lot of times, particularly in these borderland areas, they may not necessarily like each other, but in a way they're dependent upon one another for knowledge and food and trade, etc., etc. So when I'm talking about a smallpox epidemic that's working its way through native indigenous communities, right? It's obviously not going to be something that's working its way only through indigenous communities, because those people are in contact with other people as well, and this is going to be something that's a common experience. Yeah, it's a good question.
Let's see, there's another one here. Another commenter offered, there was a second question in terms of the naming of the disease by the Native American populations. And another participant came back and said, Comanches called it tazia, which apparently is an allusion to the rash.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know that I knew that, but I think over the years I've seen lots of references to it, often in translation, right? So you don't get the indigenous word, but and it will usually be some kind of descriptor, so that from the terms used, you know what they're talking about, the rotting flesh or the rash or that, and also I've seen it. I know I've seen it described with terms like devil, right? Well, I think that's, of course, a European, maybe a missionary's connotation of it. But I think a lot, if not all of these words, of course, will convey what we know was terror, because it would have been terror because humanity. This was the terror of humanity, not just in native people, until smallpox was, declared extinct in 1980. This was one of the great terrors of humankind through history, and and I think it's such a it kind of lends itself to those sort of terms and names because of the horror of the disease as well, where you watch your loved ones literally rotting before you.
Just horrible. I think that concludes our questions. Of course, there's a lot of appreciation for the fact in terms of the broader context and big picture you've provided in terms of the epidemic across the West, and how that interacts, and from the perspective of many of our participants in terms of New Mexico history, and how that indirect ways has affected events throughout the region. So I didn't know whether you had any last comments. And
well, I think that's a good place to leave. I mean, I do one of the things that I like to use in classes and talking is the image of a kind of a wheel, right, with a hub and spokes coming out of it. Because one of the things that I always complain about is that notion of when we look at Native American history, how are we ever really going to understand and get a grasp of Native American history if we think of Native American people as always being on the western edge of American history, right? I don't think that people live on other people's borders. People live at the center of their own universe. And I'm obviously, as you can see, I'm a big picture guy. I like to think about that. But the great thing about history is, of course, all history is local history, right? Mark Simmons showed us that, right? And so when I'm talking about something like this, that, bringing in China and all that kind of thing, that may take it global, but of course you zero in on, in this case, New Mexico and make New Mexico the hub of this story. And it all connects, right? It all revolves around here. Or you could shift this and take it up onto the, the plains of Saskatchewan, where the Blackfeet and the Shoshone and the Cree and various people are mixing, because you can slice these stories in different ways. And they're like the winter count that we looked at, or like the winter count that you guys tried to look at, and I sent you in the wrong direction. They go in cycles, right? It's not a steadily moving line, but rather something in which there's these tremendous interconnections. And that's why I think a big story like this, grounded in a place like New Mexico, it's got so much mileage to it. So I appreciate being asked to do this.
Well, thank you again. One quick small question. You mentioned the book Pax Americana, and the author again was?
Elizabeth Fenn, F-E-N-N.
Okay, we'll share that info with our audience in case for those that wish to pursue that. Also, we'll post the information in terms of Mark Simmons' article, which was in the New Mexico History Review back in 1966. So that will be fine. I want to thank you very much. It's been most stimulating and much appreciate that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
You're welcome. For our audience, again, if this lecture will be posted on the New Mexico History Museum YouTube and Facebook pages in the next couple of days, and we will be posting it for historical reference on the New Mexico Friends of History nm.org, the New Mexico, the Friends of History webpage, and so that you can have possible reference. The information in terms of the books we will include in the chat, which will be appended with the lecture. So again, thank you very much to our guest, Dr. Calloway, and also to our audience. And we look forward to seeing you all on March 3rd.
Thank you very much.